All right, kia ora and good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for what we've now termed our monthly economic briefings provided by Infometrics to our clients. Just wanting to make sure that we're trying to get as much of our analysis and thinking in front of our variety of clients across the country, whether they be in local government, business, building, transport, education, or anywhere else, really, just to try and provide a bit more of that thinking that we often are discussing in the office and that we're considering when we're evaluating where New Zealand's economy is heading and trying to get that useful information into decision makers' hands. My name is Brad Olsen. I'm a senior economist here at Infometrics, and I'm joined by Rob Hayes, one of our other senior economists. Thanks, Rob, for coming on board today. We've shifted things up a little bit. I'm no longer zooming in from my ironing board at home. Instead, I'm coming to your screens from the Infometrics video calling facility, also known as part of the server room here at the office. So a slightly different setup. Glad to have retired the ironing board for now and get it back to ironing shirts and similar. Look, what we want to do for you this morning is very similar to our other sort of sessions during lockdown and into level 3 and then early into level 2, is provide around about half an hour's worth of our analysis, and that'll take around about 3 parts. Firstly, I just want to run you through relatively quickly a whole range of different economic data and some of the analysis that we've been looking at in the last week and the last month or so, just to give you a flavour of how that's shaping our view of the economy. I'll then give you a very brief overview of how we see the sector recovery possibly coming through across New Zealand. We're putting out our newsletter tomorrow, in which we've got a full piece of analysis on what jobs could look like in 2025, who's recovering and who's not, and also at what sort of pace. And then Rob's going to have a bit of a look into how the tertiary education sector is set up to deliver this sort of re-education and the training modules that New Zealand is going to need through these changing times. Of course, we've got the Trades and Apprenticeship Scheme, which has been announced by the government, and he'll have a little bit of a look and analyse just some preliminary views on how it might be set up to deliver for the country. The last sort of bit of, if you will, health and safety or housekeeping is down the bottom of your screen. You will find a lovely Q&A button. Feel free to click that one at any point and put your questions in. And after Rob and I have spoken for around about half an hour or so, we'll spend the remainder of the hour answering some of your questions and going through some of those other bits and pieces that might be things that we've either touched on or other bits and pieces that you guys might have to ask. And I know we've had a few emails through, and I've got a bit of paper next to me as well with some of those questions. So look, without further ado, we'll jump right into it. And I guess it's worthwhile highlighting what a roller coaster we've been on over the last month, over the last few months, really. Of course, COVID coming through, starting off in China at the end of last year, but really hitting New Zealand's airwaves. I think it was something like the 26th, 27th of January, just as it started to become quite a big threat or a looming threat at that point. And I remember the first conversation I had with someone about what was then just the new coronavirus. And it was very much a trade-dominated story, particularly around China. And of course, it very rapidly spread after that within the month. It was very much all over the country, all over the world. And I remember when I was traveling across the country with some of my colleagues, we were discussing with clients what it might look like. And at that early stage, again, we were looking at it and considering it to be very much a SARS-based evaluation. Obviously, things have completely changed. And I guess where we see the economy now is it's out of the immediate worst effects. We're out of lockdown. We're out of level 3. We're out of level 2. Now at level 1, really the only restrictions that remain on the economy are our border protections. And of course, they were a little bit more porous than we might have liked up until a few days ago. So of course, there has been, I guess, a rising concern over the potential for a second round of COVID cases, both here, but actually importantly, the international cases overseas have just exploded in recent days. I think it was either yesterday or the day before, the World Health Organization announcing the largest daily increase for quite a while. And that's it's still concentrated in some pretty important areas. The likes of the US still seeing a large caseload increase. Brazil also showing up some huge numbers, and a spread as well in the likes of India, as well as into the African region. So I guess what that profiles is that this is not over by a long shot. We may well have been through the worst immediate short, sharp shock of level 4, but there's a lot of water to go under the bridge, and we do still face some very, very tough times ahead in many regards. Last week, we got the first read from GDP looking at the March quarter, so just up until the end of March, incorporating, I think, the first 6 days of lockdown. It was worse than all of the forecasters, including us, had expected. Our model's not quite good enough to pick up when you try and shut down an economy for 6 days. I guess the point to make, well, a few points to make on those GDP results. The first one is that the 1.6% reduction quarterly in GDP, that was bad. It was the worst in 29 years. June will just be off the scales. And that is what happens when you close down the economy for essentially a month during the quarter. It's just going to be huge. What we have also seen, though, through those GDP numbers was those immediate effects that we saw coming through the trade route, but also concerningly some very soft numbers coming through around business investment. And that's before we started to see a real decline in New Zealand's economic performance. This was still as we were trying to sort of muddle our way through the tourism implications. So that soft business investment doesn't bode well for how New Zealand sort of develops through this. So some concerns emerging there. Again, we'll get a better read as we move forward. Now, one of the things we have been looking at much more closely, and something that is a lot more timely, is the number of job seekers who are losing their jobs, are having to access government support, as well as some of the employment indicators out from Stats NZ. Now, the next set of employment indicators will come out on Monday. We'll have a write-up for clients in the afternoon looking at that. Of course, the first set showing that there were, I think, 37,500 jobs seasonally adjusted lost in the month of April alone. Job seeker numbers and benefit numbers highlighting that 50,000 people are now on government support since the week before the lockdown started. Again, some considerable losses coming through there for the economy. Now, I note all of those because I guess the point I'm trying to make is that the economy has been hit hard, but in the last few weeks, there's been a lot more optimism about where New Zealand is heading, about the economic fortunes. Now, that is important. We are starting to get back towards normal. The economy is starting to function again. But I do want to highlight that we are not through the worst of it yet. There's still a lot of artificial support being brought in there. And what I'll do with that is I just want to share my screen, and we have got some slides to show you today. And the first one that I want to highlight is some work that we've been looking at in terms of the potential second wave of unemployment. This graph here from some analysis we put out, I think, a week ago, shows this first initial hit coming through. This is sort of, the first week of lockdown, the number of people each week that were added to the job seeker line. Now, what we've also got to realise is these next few weeks, we have a huge number of Kiwi workers who go from being government supported through the wage subsidy to not supported. Now, there is the wage subsidy extension, and that will certainly save more jobs than we'd previously expected. But one of the things we are becoming concerned about is the second and third wave, which we're expecting the third wave to come in around sort of October, November, December. And I just want to step you through the two reasons we see those coming through and highlighting why there is still a number of jobs to be lost. With this extension, we are going to see workers who are kept on by businesses, but we've also started hearing a lot of businesses who are trying to collapse their operations down and consolidate their operations from what they had previously. So if you had a cafe that was previously working at 4 different locations, you may well condense that down to 2 locations and cut some of your staff because you know that there's not the same amount of economic activity out there. At the same time, the remaining staff that you've kept for the 2 sites you are leaving open, you might well try and get the wage subsidy extension for them. So the wage subsidy extension, a very, very important part of the puzzle, and will keep more people employed, but still some tough times to go under the bridge moving forward. The other thing, I guess, to highlight is that we are still seeing some real, I guess, mixed bag elements coming through from our trade picture as well. And this, if I show you this graph here, looking at our trade profile over the last week, we'll get some new data out tomorrow. But what it does show is that in line with this global softening in economic activity, that our trade profile has started to slip just a touch. Now, look, we always knew that this was coming, but it does highlight that, the global impacts of COVID-19 are still going to persist for a long time, and that New Zealand, as an export-dominated or export-orientated economy, is going to need to be cognizant of those changes. We can't trade our way out of it fully because that global demand is not going to be there. We also can't rely simply on domestic demand to get New Zealand through this. You can see on this graph a bit of a decline coming through in total exports alongside some of our non-food manufacturing. Dairy's also in a slight decline. Fruit has moved slightly into the declining territory alongside seafood, which hasn't really recovered. At the same time, you have had a good profile coming through from meat in recent times alongside forestry, and forestry starting to pick up a lot of steam after having a pretty hard and tough life through most of the early stages of COVID-19 in New Zealand. So we're not falling off the bridge yet, but it does highlight that there is going to be softness throughout the world. Global growth expectations are still being revised down rapidly, and the OECD, of course, 2 weeks ago, making some pretty sobering predictions about where the global economy is heading. So again, not trying to be too doom and gloom, but just wanting to highlight that while there is a lot of optimism and good activity happening in the New Zealand economy, that we're not through the worst of it yet. The other thing to note is that some of the supports that we often get in an economic downturn, we're not getting to the same degree because New Zealand is doing so well. If we look at the likes of the exchange rate as well as government bond yields, we can see there that we suffered a pretty bad run if you look at where the exchange rates were sort of sitting at this point throughout March and through into April and May. It then sort of took off again, and we got, to a pretty good position. We're talking 65 US cents to the dollar coming through in sort of the start of June, and there was a lot of optimism there that because New Zealand was doing particularly better than the US, that we would recover better, and therefore the dollar was rising. What we did see is that the OECD report did sort of take the wind out of everyone's sails a bit, noting that this is going to be a longer profile for recovery. We are going to see some big changes, and therefore we need to moderate that stance. And you can see both for the exchange rate, but also for interest rates, that they had this bit of a rally, and then they've started to soften back a touch. Still in a stronger position than we might like, but I guess that does highlight that New Zealand is, comparatively speaking, doing considerably better than any other parts of the world. Often people are joking that New Zealand's getting angry at 2 cases of COVID slipping through when countries are having hundreds every day popping up, if not thousands. So some risks here in terms of just how competitive some of our exports become, and the Reserve Bank will be walking a very fine line, I'd expect, tomorrow when they look at the official cash rate and the monetary policy settings. They do want to demonstrate that New Zealand is open for business to get business investment and consumer sentiment going. At the same time, they don't want to talk up the economy too much, because otherwise we will see a continuation of these trends with the dollar going higher and similar. Now, one thing I did want to profile was that there's been a lot of conversation about working from home, and it's been interesting talking to some big firms that there is going to be a shift in working and where people are working and living. And I guess it's probably more pronounced than we might have initially expected. A lot of organisations up and down the country very quickly had to learn how to work from home. But now that we are back down to a level where people can go to the office and there is the option to get back into CBDs, a lot of people still aren't particularly keen. And that highlights 2 things. Firstly, that we have had job losses, and so there's not as much need for some people to travel around. But secondly, talking to a number of big firms, there is definitely an appetite to understand how to, reshape their workforces or redefine what the working week looks like. So there are going to be some big challenges moving forward for some of our urban centres, particularly because the focus at the moment for a lot of businesses has been that working from home is providing activity in suburbs, but not necessarily in urban CBDs. So a change in where the money is being spent, particularly important in Wellington, of course, where the public service has been operating from home, which a lot of the time, or more than any other sector, is not in Wellington City. So some changes coming through. Some numbers from both Auckland and Wellington in terms of public transport use, which gives us a bit of an idea of how much people are going back to work or not in the office. You can see for Auckland, even at level 1, still pretty far down, not even hitting the peak, the low of Easter last year. And for the likes of Wellington, still not quite making it up to the highest level yet. So getting better again is that picture, but it's still a long slog to get through, a lot of changes still to go under the bridge here. Now, the one I want to sort of highlight and sort of profile quickly, and this is very much what we'll be analysing in depth in tomorrow's article, and just wanted to give you, I guess, a bit of a sneak peek and a bit of a discussion on what this all means, is that we're still expecting, and we are going through our forecasting round at the moment, but we are expecting that the New Zealand economy will still take a while to recover from this. We've already lost 50,000 odd jobs in sort of 2.5, 3 months. That is not something that you can easily regain. One of the criticisms we had of the budget, as I think we detailed in the last webinar we held, was that during the GFC, it took New Zealand 3.5 years to gain back 60,000 odd jobs. We're expecting, or Treasury rather, was expecting that New Zealand might regain 190,000 jobs within around about 2 years. Now, highlighting that if we've already lost 50,000, that's pretty close to the GFC hit already. There is still a longer profile for how New Zealand recovers. What we've done though is had a bit of a first look, and again, these are very preliminary estimates, but looking at what the size of each industry could look like in 2025 compared to sort of an estimated pre-pandemic level. And you can see there's quite a lot of variation there. If we look at the top areas, the likes of professional, scientific and technical services, alongside public admin and safety, so think public service broadly there, we do see that those are able to get away a lot faster and are, you know, anywhere between sort of 7 and 10 odd % larger than they were pre-pandemic. And that speaks to, one, the expansion of support that is going to be needed from the public service, but also that the private sector is going to have to enable new business creation and a change in business focus. And that's where professional, scientific and technical services come into their own. There is going to be that reimagination of business. A lot more of it is probably going to be somewhat digitally based. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a huge amount more work for those in the digital professions. You can see that down the bottom here with information, media and telecommunications. But what it does mean is that there is going to have to be a lot of support for transitioning businesses or helping move businesses from one form of activity to another. We can also see, for example, that healthcare is going to hold up pretty well. It's still definitely going to be needed more now than in what we'd previously expected it to be. Interesting, of course, to see that our manufacturing services are expected to get going again, particularly as the global economy starts to move forward again. The likes of education and training not showing quite as much scope to get going quite as quickly, is of course going to be a very, very important part of New Zealand's recovery. We're just balancing that against the lower profile for international education to come to New Zealand. That will affect balance sheets moving forward for educators, and so just tempering back any particular growth we might see. The interesting four at the bottom, though, I do want to profile because there is an important message coming through here. The first one, that information, media and telecommunications, essentially what that points towards is that, one, there is going to be some irreversible losses in that industry. They're not going to be able to be regained over time. For media, there is going to be considerable consolidation, and we're already seeing that prior to COVID. This is a little bit sort of bringing forward some of those very tricky and thorny issues, but as well as that, it speaks to a change in capitalisation, a shift away in some regards from workers and more towards capital inputs, you know, machines, robots, computers and similar. Those sort of changes are going to be important. The other three, though, if we look at accommodation and food services, retail and wholesale trade, and transport, postal and warehousing, there are going to be some big changes in that tourism sector. It is just not going to get back to the same level, even in 5 years' time. It is going to be a slower profile for getting that sector back on track, and that is going to mean that job numbers remain limited for a period moving forward. So just highlighting there are some tricky changes coming through here, and how that plays out on a regional basis is something that we'll continue to explore, particularly once we update our forecast sort of in September, October. We'll have a bit more of a think around how some of these preliminary numbers might be playing out. And at that point, I'd expect we'll be in a position to not only highlight how we see the near-term effects of COVID hitting regional areas, but then looking as well at what those future directions might look like, particularly important as we move into a long-term plan year next year. Really, this is going to be the recovery budget moving forward for local government, trying to figure out how to keep their capital spending elements moving, while at the same time as trying to navigate some very tough revenue streams. Now, the one other part I just want to share briefly before I pass over to Rob to have a look at the education, and a bit of a segue, if you will, but not totally, is just highlighting some of the construction and housing elements we've seen in recent times, because I know there's a huge amount of interest from all of our clients around how that market is shaping up. Now, of course, some early signs of possible weakness coming through in some of the housing numbers. They just weren't quite as strong as we might have expected, but we are still seeing the likes of construction levels holding up. Now, at the moment, the feeling is that the next sort of 6 to 9 months for construction may well be all right. There's still a bit of catch up after the lockdown, and there's still activity that was on the books prior to COVID coming through. So all of that has to be built through. However, once we get past that, there is an emerging softness that comes through. And I guess you've got to remember as well that this mortgage holiday is going to fade away. There are going to be more people in vulnerable housing positions. Now, to highlight that, between February and April this year, so between pre-COVID and post-lockdown, there was $13 billion worth of mortgages and other sort of housing-related investments that were changed from interest and principal payments to interest only. Just a bit of an early signal of the concerns around the housing market. At the same time, the Commission for Financial Capability ran a survey of, I think it was 4,000 representative New Zealanders, and found that 10% had missed or hadn't been able to make either a mortgage or a rent payment during level 4, and 34% of Kiwis were in a financially difficult position when it came to housing costs, which was the highest out of a number of developed countries they looked at. They looked at the likes of the UK and Canada having slightly lower levels of financial distress. So highlighting that we are still at the moment picking an 11% decline in house prices across the country, some vulnerabilities already coming through in the likes of Queenstown with higher listings numbers, of course concerns remaining around some of those areas. The last point I'll make on that is that, of course, when you look at construction efforts, there is, of course, a lot of hope that shovel-ready projects will come through. We're still waiting with bated breath on those. We haven't seen any massive announcements come through from the government. There have, of course, been those first 11 projects that were announced as part of the RMA fast track process. But man, considering there was $136 billion worth of projects that were asked for, we're still, really a little bit dubious over the government's ability to deliver those in a quick and fast manner to get the construction sector moving. The risk, of course, is if we do have a trans-Tasman bubble that opens up and New Zealand doesn't have a good pipeline of work, we could well lose a number of our skilled workers over to Australia as they look for a different option. The very last thing before I hand over to Rob is very much on that trans-Tasman bubble. Everyone was expecting we could sort of see it maybe early July, maybe September if we were, took a little bit longer. I think we need to be realistic at this point that, in fact, according to the Australians particularly, it is more likely to be an early 2021 timeframe before that bubble is reopened. So it is still going to be a tough road for tourism operators through there. So again, don't want to be too doom and gloom. Do want to be realistic, though, that although the New Zealand economy is starting to get its momentum back, there is still a number of issues to be played out, a number of changes that are going to occur in the economy. There is still a long road to go yet. Rob, you've obviously got some thoughts on where we go from here and how we get New Zealand back on track. What's your sort of first cut of the analysis when we look at those training modules?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. What I want to show you today is some very preliminary analysis, and I'm going to keep emphasizing that as I go because it really is. There we go. So I'm going to start really, I have a nice kind of segue from Brad's last slide. So looking at these job openings, this kind of projected recovery that's going to happen across these industries as we get out to kind of 2025, I'm starting to ask the question, how does the tertiary education system need to respond to support that recovery, to make sure that there are the skilled people with the skills and the qualifications that New Zealand needs to fill these jobs. It's an area of work that Infometrics wants to get into. It's a very challenging area to get into. We're basically trying to compare provision in the tertiary education system with the skills that employers need. And that's difficult because there are a few areas of the labour market where there is a fairly clear alignment of the skills that employers need and qualifications. And I'm thinking of like health occupations and a number of trades. But in most areas of the labour market, people go into jobs with a whole range of different qualifications. And so we're kind of focusing on the former rather than the latter. It's a really important area to get into, though, because the current government has been talking about the need for the tertiary education system, as well as the immigration system and the welfare system, to be responsive to what's happening in the labour market. And to be honest, when I first arrived in New Zealand 20 years ago and I joined the Department of Labour, we were having exactly the same conversation back then, which underscores the importance of that conversation, as well as the difficulty of getting it right. Most developed economies are trying to do this because getting a good alignment between the education system and the labour market can have such great benefits for things like productivity, as well as the benefits for those individuals who get the right kinds of qualifications and are able to fully utilize those qualifications in their jobs. So I'm going to focus today on that $320 million that was allocated in the budget for free trades training. And the government said that they wanted to link those subsidies to courses in building and construction, agriculture, manufacturing, and to a much lesser extent, community health, counselling and care work. That funding is available from the 1st of July and it's available for 2 years. And we're thinking that the people that will go into those kinds of courses will be then emerging from the education system around 2022, 2023, when those job openings start to arise. So I'm going to focus on that training in building and construction, agriculture and manufacturing. I want to look at the historical profile of qualification completions in those fields of study and compare that with the job openings that happened in those areas historically, to come up with a kind of ratio of tertiary education completions to job openings. And then I'm going to look forward and say, well, okay, if we assume that ratio of completions to job openings needs to stay the same, then given the number of job openings that we're expecting from around 2023, 24, 25, how many completions do we need in those areas? And I'm going to say again, it's a preliminary analysis. It's not, there's a lot of ifs and buts when you're doing this kind of an analysis. It's very much a conversation starter. It's not the final word by any means, because there are a lot of things that can happen that you don't see in the numbers. The other thing I want to say is that we're keen to work with a number of our clients that are closer to the action, particularly our ITO clients and those that are going to be transitioning into being workforce development councils, who have a much kind of closer idea of that alignment between qualifications and what employers need in the labour market. We're keen to work with you guys on this to refine the analysis and improve the analysis. So first of all, we got a couple of data sets from TEC recently. One was a list of the fields of study that are going to be subsidised through this 320 million. It's not a complete list. They took great pains to tell us that, but we think it's mostly complete. The other data set that we've been getting from TEC is a historical data set of qualification completions. And we've been working with them to try and cut out a lot of the I'm going to call it noise in the data. So for example, what you see when you look at people's completions in tertiary education is that a number of people will what we call staircase. So they'll complete qualifications at increasingly higher levels. And so what we're mostly interested in is that kind of substantive qualification that they're going to take into the labour market. So if someone completes a certificate level 3 in a building trades, and then they go on and complete a diploma in that same kind of field of study. We're mostly interested in their diploma qualification. We want to cut out the completion in that certificate level 3, because it's not the completion that they're going to be taking into the labour market to get a job. So this data set, it's going to have the numbers in it. For those of you that have your own kind of numbers around qualification completions, it's not going to look exactly like your own numbers. It's trying to focus on the qualifications that people take into the labour market. It tries to take into account that some people do change careers. They might study in one field of study 1 year, and then a few years later they might decide to get another qualification in another field of study and change careers. It's trying to take account of all of that. But we're comparing that information with all of the demand side information that you guys have seen from us for quite a number of years now. So our information on employment, and in particular our information on job openings. So job openings being not just the new jobs that are being created, but also vacancies created from people who leave the workforce and need replacing. So we're comparing those two data sets. And I think the first thing to look at is just to look at those funded training places in a little bit of context. Now, this is taking those fields of study that TEC have said are going to be funded, and looking at historical completions as a proportion of those completions in the broader fields of study. So fields of study, there's a hierarchy. There are very detailed fields of study, and they all aggregate up to broad fields of study. So we know, for example, that in engineering and related technologies, about 40% of those completions are going to be funded, because there are other fields of study in that broad field that are not going to be funded. Whereas in architecture and building and agriculture, most of the training in those areas is going to be funded. Now, this chart doesn't include the apprenticeships that are in other fields of study. So you've got funding in specific fields of study for trainees and apprentices, but the government has also said that all apprentices are going to be funded. So this chart doesn't include those apprentices outside the fields of study that TEC say are going to be funded. So there is going to be further subsidies outside of what you see in this chart, but it gives you a broad sense of how much of that training is going to be funded. So what I did was look at completions from 2015 to 2019 in those funded fields of study, and compared them with job openings over that same period. I wanted to look over a number of years and come up with an average ratio of completions to job openings. That ratio does change a little bit from year to year, and that's why I take an average. So, for example, we reckon that for every 1,000 job openings in those occupations that are related to the engineering fields of study, we reckon that there's been about 500 completions in those areas. In architecture and building, it's a little lower, it's about 300, and in that agriculture area, it's more than 1,000. So let's talk about that agriculture for a moment. That's a funny one. We're saying that for every 1,000 job openings, there are more than 1,000 people being trained in these funded fields of study. Why might that be? There's a couple of reasons. It could be that probably quite a lot of those people that are training in those areas already have a job in agriculture, and they're just upskilling. They're not necessarily new people entering the job market. But another interpretation of that is that the people who are getting qualified in those areas aren't going into those jobs. They're going into jobs in other areas. So you can see there are a number of different ways to interpret this data in ways that the data really doesn't show you. And I'm going to go back again and say that, and just emphasize once again that this is preliminary stuff, and it raises as many questions as it answers. So let's get back to the question that I asked at the start, which is what needs to happen to completions in order to meet those job openings that we think are going to occur from around 2023. Here's those engineering related fields of study that are being funded. We've got completions historically from 2015 to 2019, varying between about 6,000 and 8,000 a year. Now, if we're going to keep that ratio of completions to job openings about the same, we're going to need to see many more completions in those fields of study, something like closer to 11,000 in 2023, and then declining to about just over 8,000 in 2025. So if I was able to kind of channel people into different types of fields of study, this would be one of the ones I'd be encouraging people to get into. And this is being driven by that growth in non-food manufacturing that we saw in that chart that Brad showed us earlier. It's one of the areas of the economy that we are expecting to grow more strongly than a lot of other areas, and that's why we're seeing we need that growth in completions. Same with agriculture. So those are completions on the far right there. If you compare that bar to what we've had historically, we are going to need to see an uptick in completions in those agricultural fields of study, but less so for the architecture and building area. There's probably a little jump in completions that we're going to need around 2023, but falling back to kind of similar levels. Now, I think one of probably the last point I want to make about this is going back to especially that engineering area. What we've seen, one of the other kind of ifs and buts around all of this is that those historical completions were when the economy was on a growth path. What we're seeing from 2023 onwards is really a bounce back from a recession. So a lot of the job openings that are going to occur from around 2023 onwards, you're going to see that people who have maybe been laid off in the previous years are going to be going back into jobs. So there's going to be an element of recovery. It's not always that those industries aren't necessarily going to need new people coming out of the tertiary education system. There's going to be a stock of people who with work experience in these areas who are already qualified, who will meet some of these job openings. So this analysis might kind of overstate the number of completions that are required. And so I go back again to what I said at the start. This is a conversation starter. It's not the final word. But as I said again, this is an area that we want to get into. I want to get down into much more detail and look at specific occupations and the qualification requirements of those occupations. I've started that analysis. I reckon that there's at least probably 20% of the labour market where you can pin the jobs in that labour market down to either one specific qualification or at least a small number of qualifications. We want to work on looking at the alignment between those kinds of jobs and those qualifications. We want to look at the historical trend of completions in those qualifications, and then have something to say about how those completions need to change in order to meet the skills demands of the future. We want to be working with our ITO clients on this. If possible, we'd like to work with the new workforce development councils and the regional skills leadership groups. We think this is a really important analysis to do. But I'll hand you back to Brad and we'll start answering some of your questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rob. And I think, it's interesting as well because we are going through this there is such rapid change, and we are going to have to, with so many people looking for those retraining opportunities, also figure out how we best prepare the system for that. And I think what we're sort of hearing from your analysis is there is going to be a need to do that as well to sort of meet some of those job demands, and it's going to be how quickly and how efficiently the system can sort of pivot towards that. Look, I've got one question to start with, Robin, just because it's sort of on your topic, and it's from Nigel, and it asks about, how much, and I suspect because it's our preliminary analysis, I suspect I know the answer, but I'll ask it anyway. Have we taken into account RCC, which is where the trainee sort of has the skills and is achieving that qualification based on the prior knowledge that they already had, and so is doing the job that they have the qualification in? Particularly happens in some of the civil areas, and I guess that's one of the challenges we're going to see is particularly for those sort of areas that already have people with prior experience, and it's more trying to understand how they're best going to be able to pivot and what sort of work they need to do to get their work, to get their educational sort of framing in the right way for their workforce. Any comments on that one, Rob?
Yeah, look, it's one of the drawbacks of data. We're only able to count people when they've completed a qualification. I'm a big fan of RCC, but from an analyst perspective, I want to see people who have the right skills be awarded the qualification so that they can get into our data sets. Without them being in our data sets, it's very hard to do the analysis. It's something. When you start looking at those ratios of completions to job openings, the first thing that you have to kind of accept is that from one industry to the next, there's no one ideal ratio. And that ratio will be influenced to a degree by things like RCC. So those industries that do have a lot of people with the skills and knowledge that they need to do the job, but perhaps not the formal qualification. Perhaps that industry does need fewer completions of people coming out of the tertiary education system. So it's something we have to try and take into account when we're looking at the analysis. But the more that the tertiary education system is able to take on board RCC and get those skills recognised and get those people into our data sets, the better able we are to kind of take that into account.
Awesome, thanks, Rob. Another question coming through, and it's related to that sort of that piece we're putting out tomorrow around what the recovery profile might look like, and it's a question around: do we have an idea, and the answer is yes, we do have an idea of what the status quo would have looked like without COVID. Our previous forecasts were sort of showing strong and continued growth, not quite as strong as previous years across the economy, but still some relatively active job numbers coming through. And Rob, I think if you look at sort of the sector changes, you actually had quite a lot, still some relatively good growth in tourism-based activities. That's probably the main difference. And I mean, comparing what we've got now to the status quo is a little bit hopeless in the sense that it's just you're comparing apples with bricks. It's not even apples with pears. It's a complete other sort of thing. But I think it probably is fair to say that one of the really big differences is that tourism was still tracking along all right prior to COVID. It was starting to soften a bit, but there was still a lot of activity there. Whereas essentially we're putting back the sector sort of 15 years back into the past and trying to rebuild from there. So the growth profile would have been, I think, on a sector split quite a bit different, and you may well not have seen the same amount of growth in, say, the professional, scientific and technical services. It would have probably plodded along a little bit more normally, but you probably would have seen some still relatively strong growth in some of those other sort of tourism related sectors, and particularly transport, postal and warehousing was going along all right and is now expected to only just, I think, make it back to its pre-COVID level 5 years after this first hit. So we are able to analyse what the status quo would be, but honestly it's probably a little bit far away from anything helpful at the minute, I would suspect, Rob.
Yeah, I mean, I remember some of the conversations we were having towards the end of last year, and it looked like the New Zealand economy was just on a path of kind of weakening growth, and we were worrying about where the next upturn was going to come from. And yeah, we're so far away from those conversations now.
I mean, that conversation we had in the office last year, we were sort of trying to pick, how low would it go, and it was more sort of, would it be, 1% or 0.8 or 1.2? And now the question is sort of, well, how low does it go and how long does it stay down there? So yeah, very, very different times. One of the questions coming through as well, Robin, it touches on, I guess, a real balancing act we're having to look at the moment around sort of that food and beverage sector, which of course was and still is, I think, going to be quite a key part of our recovery story. But of course, we're grappling with at the moment, still a pretty severe drought across the country, and that profile of probably even softer global growth than we might have previously expected. And of course, we can only continue to make some of our food and beverage products if there's good demand for it overseas. So, I mean, there's still, I guess, an optimistic view of where that sector can go, but we are starting to moderate that a bit based on those sort of trade expectations. Again, the world over, we are seeing continued revisions downwards in terms of growth activity. People across the world are just not going to have the same amount of money to spend. All of those sort of factors are going to mean there's lower demand for some of our activities. So I guess what we're expecting to see there is that the food and beverage sort of area will recover, but probably, as Richard notes, probably not quite as strongly as sort of in a base case scenario. That, again, I think it points towards every sector will be hit. It's just that food and beverage probably has a little bit more of an upturn that will come through as the world continues to eat, but also as New Zealand's COVID-free status I guess provides a bit of a premium on top of our products. I mean, anything to add there, Rob?
Yeah, not really. I mean, everything, when we talk about the recession and the recovery and individual industries, it is all relative. It's a question about, well, how far will employment fall in a given industry relative to other industries, and if we're only projecting a relatively soft fall, we kind of look at that as a good news story. And then looking back at the recovery, it's a question, well, which sectors are going to recover the most and which are going to recover the fastest? It's all kind of relative at the moment, isn't it, Brad?
Yeah, very much so. And I think it's hard as well because and this is the issue we continue to struggle with, is that growth rates are a bit of a hard one to decipher because we will see incredible growth next year in GDP and every other metric. And that's what happens when you take such a massive hit. It's probably important for viewers to remember, and it's a trick I got caught out with and have been told in no uncertain terms never to do it again by the chief forecaster, that let's say activity was at level 100 and you had a 50% decline in that activity. That takes you down to level 50. If you then had a 50% increase in that activity, so 50% down and then 50% up, you still only make it to level 75. So you're still down quite a bit from your original starting position. Essentially, I guess what I'm saying is that when you hear of these big growth increases, anything off a much lower base is actually still not particularly fantastic. You're still operating below where you might have otherwise. I remember that one quite fondly from earlier days. A few questions coming in around sort of housing and construction and that, Rob, and I guess it's interesting, we have had this forecast from Infometrics of an 11% drop in house prices. I see ANZ, I think, coming out yesterday or the day before with a 12% drop, broadly in line. And I guess it is a question of also where some of these price drops are going to come through. And some of the questions we've got and hear from Philip and Darren around sort of what markets are a bit more susceptible. The first one, I guess, is sort of around Queenstown and that sort of area. They have seen such a massive increase in jobs being lost. And there is, of course, already sort of quite a big shift in the amount of Airbnbs that we're able to change on the market. Rob, you did a little bit of analysis a few years back, I think it was, on Airbnbs. And I guess at that time, it wasn't that they were actually stealing from well, a lot of the time they weren't stealing as much from the long-term rental market from memory. They were a bit different. But of course, when there is absolutely no tourism activity, if you're a landlord or, you've got a house and you're wondering, well, I can't get anyone through my Airbnb anymore, maybe I do return it back into stock. There has certainly been a bit of a change in that market around sort of just how much supply. I mean, anything to add there? Because I know that you've sort of had a look at that in a little bit more detail than I have.
Yeah, well, the analysis I did for Queenstown, there was a lot of analysis, but ultimately we couldn't kind of create a clear line of sight between properties that were being placed on Airbnb and what had been done with those properties previously. But circumstantially, it did look like some properties were being taken out of the long-term rental market. The conventional wisdom seems to be at the moment that a lot of people who have got properties on Airbnb will be running for cover and getting back into the long-term rental market. Seems like every time I drive my kids to school, I'm hearing advertisements on the radio from property managers trying to encourage people to sign up with them. So that might be an indication as well. So, you know, it might be that one of the few good things that are going to come out of this current recession for areas like Queenstown, but also Rotorua and other areas that have been struggling with their housing stock, that they might see that at least in the short to medium term, that the rental market will pick up again. There'll be a lot greater supply, and therefore, if not a reduction in rents, then at least keep a cap on rents, which will be good news for those renters who who are cash strapped.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have already started to see in some of the numbers as well, those rising counts of people on accommodation supplements and similar. So you're right, it is going to be important, not just because of the sort of, the price reductions, but generally because people have less money to be able to spend on those sort of things. And so trying to meet that crisis is going to be quite important. One of the other questions we're getting through, and it's more sort of about the macroeconomic outlook, and it's a question from Greg around, look, Westpac's been quite open that they've been putting up their forecasts because of how quickly New Zealand's been able to move through the alert systems. And I guess the question from Greg is sort of what are we thinking in terms of our forecast? And I mean, a few points. The first one is that Westpac was always, in our minds, overly optimistic to start with, so they're turning more optimistic now. And I guess this is the balancing game that we're trying to play from a forecasting point of view, is that based on the alert levels, New Zealand has gone through better than we might have initially expected, in the sense that, we were able to get down to level 2 quite quickly. We only had 2 weeks at level 3. Level 2 also didn't have the same level of travel restrictions that we might have imagined, and we're already back down to level 1. The thing that is balancing against that sort of swift speed is a few things. The first one is that you've got to remember that the hit during the lockdown was still substantial. From a consumer spending point of view, there's a $3 billion hole in what companies didn't manage to bring in. And although there has been a bit of a surge post-lockdown and post-level 3, it probably hasn't been quite as amazing as we might have expected. There's still a lot of people sitting on their cash, a lot of people trying to keep more money in the bank or in their back pocket in case things turn worse. So better in some regards, worse or not quite as good as we might have expected in others. The big change, of course, has been that global outlook, and I guess that has been souring probably even more than we might have expected. And with that sour global outlook, it does mean that our trade position probably isn't as fantastic moving forward. We also haven't got the Trans-Tasman bubble coming in probably quite as quickly as we might have anticipated. So some changes coming through there. And I guess, look, the reason I'm a bit more downbeat than other forecasters is that we have still a lot of changes to come through. You got to remember that each week for the next, I think it is 2 weeks, you've got nearly 500,000 Kiwi workers that go from being government supported to possibly not. So there is still a lot of, I guess, government support that is making some sort of quite mixed signals across the data. There is quite a lot of changes to still come through. There's a lot of dynamism still in the economy. And I guess that while we are starting to see more activity and more positive natures coming through, from a lot of data sets, we've also got not a huge amount of sort of further positive news to bring forward. At the moment, we are a little bit in limbo, in the sense we've moved down to level 1, which is fantastic, but there's not a lot further that we can move going forward. We're not going to see those borders being relaxed anytime soon. So what we've currently got is probably as close to a new normal in the short term as we might expect for the next 6 months. And that, I think, is a little bit of a risk, because there's sort of still no light at the end of the tunnel. We already expected that, ours was probably one of the more pessimistic, but we were still feeling that a lot of the banks, certainly in the early days, had quite an optimistic view of the economy. The restructuring, the changes, the amount of job losses coming through so quickly means that we may well be revising our starting point up a little bit, but probably what we're doing is, instead of having it sort of drop so deep, or unemployment or similar rising so high, it's more that we're going to smooth that curve, because there has been so much government stimulus, so much government intervention, but we still expect that, you know, the number of jobs being lost will remain at a very high level, and higher in some regards than other forecasters, including Treasury, might be expecting. So on one hand, our forecasts are possibly going to get a little bit, very tiny bit more optimistic in the near term, but the profile is still a very, very long game to be played through all of this. Another couple of questions coming through. I'm just making sure I'm clicking on them and getting through them. And one is, and Rob, I mean, it's something that you sort of touched on with, you know, when we looked at some of those construction numbers. It's a question from David around, we don't see construction playing quite a strong role in the recovery response. Is that based on sort of what we've heard, or in my case, not heard from government in recent times? I guess it is sort of that. I mean, we've got to recognise that the last time we had a downturn, that was the GFC. And to be clear, it wasn't anywhere near as bad as what we've currently seen. Even that stripped away so much capacity, so much of a supply response from the construction sector, that when the country started going again, the construction sector just couldn't get going nearly as quickly, which is why, in part, we had such a low build rate, and also weren't able to sort of meet our migration needs. So on our minds, the construction sector doesn't do fantastically well through this. Of course, at the moment, if you've got an existing project, you're all right, but talking to everyone across town and across the country, if you've got a new development coming on board, your ability to get finance is very limited, if you can find anything at all. So on the residential side, there's not quite as much work. Now, sure, the government is coming forward with some more activities, and that will be important, but it doesn't really shift the dial. When we put in the extra 8,000 state houses that the government is funding through Budget 2020, there wasn't a huge amount of movement in our forecasts. And we do remain incredibly circumspect over the government's ability to deliver some of that infrastructure. In the short term, that infrastructure that we're going to see was already sort of factored into our forecast. We already expected it to come through, because it was funded by local government. So if you look at our sort of forecast prior to COVID, it's more a question of who's paying for it now, rather than is it going to happen. If anything, the slow speed of government getting money out the door for some of these projects has a downside risks to our investment expectations. Now, moving forward, there is, I guess, still that concern that there's not a huge amount coming through from the government. We'd already factored in the New Zealand upgrade program, $12 billion worth of stimulus spending across the country, but a lot of it being focused in on Auckland. So in our minds, I guess the infrastructure stuff keeps a bit of a hold or a foundation underneath our economic activity. It's not going to be the silver bullet that sort of makes the economy start to move forward. And there's a risk there, I guess, as well, Rob, with those apprentices where and some of those trades training, where we are going to need them sort of more towards the end of the forecast period, but we are going to need to make sure there's enough activity for them to get going. Anything to add on that side?
Yeah, it is tricky. Construction in particular. I heard a story when I was working at MB a few years ago about the what happened in Christchurch, and after the earthquakes, there was a glut of people going into construction qualifications. They came out fully qualified, but at that precise time, the insurance processes hadn't run their course, and the city wasn't ready to start rebuilding. And so those people, either, I think a lot of them went to Australia, or they went and worked elsewhere. And so when the rebuild did eventually begin, it was basically the city was relying on migrants coming in with those construction skills. And it just underlines the fact that, I don't know if construction is different to other industries. I suspect it might be, but it underlines the fact that in that industry, at least, you need people with the right skills at exactly the right time. If they're a little early or if they're a little late, they're going to miss the job opportunities that are available. And so that is something that's a worry. I know from the very beginning that the government, I think, has been trying its best to kind of keep businesses open until the economy starts going again, and you know, that supporting the wage subsidy, supporting people who are already in apprenticeships to keep going with their apprenticeships. It's all kind of geared towards that. But I would say that, yeah, probably construction is going to be a tougher nut to crack than any. And I think we are going to see a lot of people leave that industry in the next few years. And it is going to be hard for it then to kind of ramp up its activity once the economy does start get going again.
And a lot of sequencing needed there is sort of what I'm hearing, and some challenges as well, considering just how fast it has grown in recent years, and the ability, you know, just it's so much larger now than it was 5 years ago. It does create issues for its sort of short-term ability to retain that workforce. So yeah, some big challenges coming through there. The last question we'll go through, and then I think we'll basically close it off, and that's around the potential for increased protectionism globally, particularly around the likes of primary production. I think there's a lot of talk at the moment around sort of buy local and similar, and I guess that's fine in the short run, particularly when we do have so many supply constraints across the world. I mean, I bought something from the US the other day, and because of all of the issues that's going on there, it made its way from North Carolina to Florida to Houston, Texas, before getting on a plane to New Zealand. So it's crisscrossed sort of half of the US, and again, it's taken about 3 weeks to do that. So there are still some quite big supply constraints across the world, and that is going to mean that in the short term that protectionism is a fair bit higher, both from a political point of view, but more importantly from just a practical point of view. I guess it does raise some questions though over moving forward. What is the potential for increased protectionism in particularly in the primary sector, to sort of lock out New Zealand's ability to gain from this? And I guess, look, there's always been protections for some of these sectors, particularly in the likes of Europe. I think what New Zealand's got an advantage from here is, one, we are considered a safe pair of hands. You know, we have good, high quality products that come out of our primary sector generally, and there's still a lot of demand for that, particularly in the sort of after a health crisis. I see a lot of people talking about, I think it was kiwi fruit demand increasing across the world because people are looking for a healthy fruit option to keep their immune systems boosted and similar sorts of things. Again, our milk products and similar are of high regard alongside meats and everything else. So we could well see more protectionism come, and I think our focus needs to be on trading on our good name and protecting that good name moving forward. And I guess you can see how quickly that turns on ahead in terms of, our salmon exports have been stopped to China temporarily because the new outbreak in Beijing coming from apparently a chopping board that salmon was being chopped on. So there's some quite swift changes that can come through in terms of consumer perception. I think it's important from our point of view to keep on top of those and keep communicating about the good quality brands and products that we've got, rather than falling too far into that trap of protectionism ourselves. So I think with that, look, thanks so much everyone for coming along. It's been great fun once again. Rob, I hope you enjoyed it. I thoroughly did. It's always nice to discuss what we've been seeing. Look, we will be doing these every month now moving forward to make sure that we're trying to get as much insights out to people as possible. If you've got questions, if you've got things you want us to touch on in future editions and similar, please get in touch. We had a few people that emailed beforehand. That was really useful to know what was top of mind and what wasn't. We're very, very open to sort of taking suggestions on what you want to hear from us next. Stay in touch, keep safe, and we'll see you in a month's time. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.